You're standing in the reed-thick darkness along the Euphrates, circa 2000 BCE. The air tastes like wet clay and frankincense. Somewhere upstream, a mother screams, not the scream of pain, but of loss, the kind that carves itself into stone. Another child has vanished in the night, another fever that won't break, another stillbirth that the midwives can't explain. And you're about to meet the reason why. Welcome to Mr.Sleepless channel, and I'm Owlman. Tonight we drift into the deep mist of an older world in the 7-part series, The Origin of Fear. Lamashtu is here, and honestly, you probably won't survive learning her full name without checking over your shoulder for the rest of the week. So, before you dive into this story, take a second to hit that like and subscribe button, but only if this really ignites a fire in you for the legendary events I tell. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I want to know who else is losing sleep with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're holding something impossibly old, a clay tablet no bigger than your palm, covered in wedge-shaped marks that look like bird tracks in mud. It's 2000 BCE, and you're standing in a Babylonian scribe's workshop that smells like wet earth and lamp oil. The scribe's hands are shaking as he carves, and you need to understand why. He's not writing a shopping list or a tax record. He's writing a name. The first demon name humanity ever committed to permanent record. Lamashtu. Before her, monsters were nameless. Shadows, vague threats, the thing in the cave, the beast in the water. But Lamashtu, she got a name, a genealogy, a complete biographical entry in humanity's first encyclopedia of terror. And that tells you everything about how badly she scared them. You don't name something unless you absolutely have to. Unless not naming it, not acknowledging it, not preparing for it means watching everything you love disappear in the night. The Sumerians called her Dim. The Akkadians called her Lamashtu. 7 names total, actually, because apparently one wasn't enough to contain her. Daughter of Anu, the sky god, which means she wasn't some random evil spirit. She had pedigree, divine parentage, cosmic legitimacy, and her father still kicked her out of heaven. Think about that for a second. The king of the gods looked at his own daughter and said, "I love you, but you're terrifying and you need to leave." That's the divine equivalent of, "It's not me, it's definitely you." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Lamashtu appears in texts dating back to the old Babylonian period, around 1900 BCE, making her one of the oldest named supernatural entities in human history. Older than most gods, people still worship today. She predates the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. She was ancient when the pyramids were new, and she was already the most feared thing in Mesopotamia. Not because she was the strongest demon, but because of what she targeted. Children. Always children. Specifically, the most vulnerable ones. Newborns, infants still nursing, children with fevers, and pregnant women whose bellies she'd touch 7 times like some horrific countdown timer. The texts describe her with uncomfortable specificity. A woman's body with a lion's head, donkey's teeth and ears, bird's talons for feet, and hands that end in claws. She's covered in symbols of death and chaos, nursing a pig and dog at her breasts, because the Mesopotamians understood that the corruption of motherhood was the deepest horror. clutching serpents, riding a donkey through the darkness. But here's what makes your skin crawl. She wasn't random. The tablets describe patterns, methods, signatures. If your child had a fever that spiked at night but cooled by morning, Lamashtu. If a pregnant woman suddenly craved specific foods she'd never wanted before, Lamashtu, already marking her territory. If breast milk turned sour or bloody, Lamashtu's touch. The ancient physicians, and yes, Mesopotamia had physicians, actual doctors with diagnostic manuals, kept detailed records of her attacks the way modern epidemiologists track disease outbreaks. Historians still argue whether Lamashtu was created to explain infant mortality, or whether the belief in Lamashtu actually shaped how they interpreted childhood illness. Chicken or egg, demon or diagnosis. The texts don't separate supernatural from natural causes. They're the same thing. A fever is a demon. The demon is the fever. There's no distinction. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some amulets depict Lamashtu with a comb, straightening her wild hair. Scholars found this detail fascinating because it suggests vanity, personality, almost humanity. She's not just a force of nature. She's a being with preferences, habits, maybe even insecurities. Some incantations actually try to flatter her. O Lamashtu, beautiful daughter of Anu, your hair shines like. It's the ancient equivalent of complimenting a serial killer's outfit while slowly backing toward the exit. You're watching mothers in ancient their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, hanging bronze amulets above cradles. You're seeing fathers commission expensive protective plaques they can barely afford. You're hearing whispered prayers that sound like negotiations with a hostage taker. Take offerings instead. Take anything instead. Just not my child. The psychological weight of this is crushing. Imagine living in a world where 1 in 3 children dies before age 5. That's the actual historical rate. And you need a reason, a face, something to blame that isn't random cosmic cruelty. Lamashtu gives you that. She's terrible, yes, but she's knowable. She has rules. She can be warded off, distracted, maybe even bargained with. Random chance can't be negotiated with. A demon can. The tablets describe her voice. This is the part that stays with you, as a lullaby sung slightly wrong. The melody's familiar, but the rhythm's off, like a music box winding down. You'd hear it outside your window and think it was a neighbor singing to her baby. By the time you realized the singing was coming from the wrong direction, moving against the wind, getting closer when it should be getting farther, she'd already found your door. And that's why she got a name. Not to diminish her, but to grip her, to hold her in language like a spell, to say, we see you, we know you, and we're ready. The first demon name was the first act of defiance against the darkness. It was humanity saying, we're terrified, yes, but we're not helpless. We'll carve your name in clay and bronze and stone. We'll make you visible. We'll fight back with words and symbols and desperate, brilliant hope. You're standing in that ancient workshop, and the scribe has finished carving. The tablet's complete. Lamashtu's name is permanent now, immortal in clay. And somewhere in the dark outside, something hears its name spoken and turns its lion's head toward the sound. She knows she's been seen, and she's coming anyway. You're watching a Babylonian Ashipu. That's a priest-physician, basically a medical exorcist, which sounds like a contradictory job title until you remember these people didn't separate medicine from magic. Examine a feverish infant. He's checking symptoms against a clay manual that reads like the world's most disturbing diagnostic flowchart. Temperature, check. Skin color, check. Cry pattern, check. And here's where it gets unsettling. He's not just diagnosing an illness. He's identifying which demon caused it, how it entered, and what stage of the attack you're currently experiencing. The 7 touches. That's Lamashtu's signature move. Her calling card. The thing every pregnant woman in Mesopotamia feared more than labor itself. The texts describe it with medical precision. She approaches from the mountains. Always the mountains. That liminal space between civilization and wilderness, and touches the pregnant woman's belly 7 times. Each touch marks a stage. First touch, you feel nothing. Maybe a flutter you mistake for the baby moving. Second touch, strange cravings start. Third touch, nightmares. By the 4th touch, you know something's wrong but can't explain what. 5th touch, physical symptoms begin. Cramping, bleeding, fever. 6th touch, the baby stops moving as much. 7th touch? The priests don't like to write about the 7th touch. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The medical diagnostic series SA.Gij, which translates roughly to the Treatise of Medical Diagnosis and Prognoses, contains over 40 tablets and dedicates multiple sections specifically to Lamashtu-related conditions. These weren't supplementary notes or folk remedies scribbled in margins. They were core curriculum for Mesopotamian physicians. You couldn't graduate medical school without knowing how to diagnose demonic possession. Imagine your doctor today having to differentiate between the flu and being haunted. That was standard practice for 3,000 years. The symptom lists are disturbingly detailed. If an infant's fever spikes at sunset and breaks at dawn, Lamashtu prefers the night shift, apparently. If the baby's head is hot, but extremities are cold, that's her draining life force from the core outward. If the child refuses the breast but cries constantly, she's poisoned the milk. If there's a rash that appears in a specific pattern, moving from torso to limbs, that's her claw marks becoming visible. The physicians drew diagrams. They created reference charts. They approached supernatural attack with the same empirical observation they used for broken bones and infected wounds. And here's where it gets genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective. Sometimes they were accidentally correct. High fever at night that breaks in the morning? That's actually consistent with certain malaria patterns. Breast milk causing infant distress? Could be mastitis or dietary issues causing inflammation. Rashes spreading in specific patterns? Infectious diseases have predictable progression. The Mesopotamians were observing real medical phenomena and attributing them to demonic cause. But the observation itself was sound. They had the science. They just wrapped it in mythology. Historians still argue whether this represents primitive medicine that hadn't evolved beyond supernatural thinking, or whether it was sophisticated medicine that used cultural metaphors to communicate complex ideas. Maybe diagnosing Lamashtu attack was shorthand for a cluster of symptoms that indicated specific treatment protocols. Maybe the demon was the disease, and naming her was how they classified and communicated medical information in a pre-scientific vocabulary. But the texts suggest they believed it literally. They describe Lamashtu's physical approach. She comes through windows, door cracks, any opening. She hides in shadows, particularly in corners where walls meet, which is why protective amulets were placed at architectural angles. She can make herself small enough to enter through keyholes. She leaves a scent behind, described as sweet rot, like fruit left too long in the sun. Mothers would smell it and know she'd been near. Your quirky tidbit for this section. Some diagnostic texts specify that Lamashtu could be identified by checking the mother's or child's urine for dancing specks of darkness. Scholars still debate what this means. Sediment? Blood cells? Some actual observable phenomenon? Several texts describe priests holding urine samples up to lamplight and looking for movement, shadow, pieces of night that shouldn't be there. It sounds like fever dream nonsense, except they treated it as legitimate medical examination with consistent methodology across multiple sources. The treatment protocols were equally specific. Remember those 7 touches? Each stage had countermeasures. Early stage, prophylactic amulets and incantations. Middle stages, offerings, ritual purification, symbolic barriers. Late stages, that's when you called in the big guns. Multi-day exorcism ceremonies involving multiple priests, expensive materials, and theatrical performances designed to convince Lamashtu to abandon her claim and move on. The ceremonies included creating a clay figurine of Lamashtu in her full grotesque glory: lion head, donkey ears, serpents, nursing animals, the whole nightmare, and then essentially staging an intervention. They'd feed the figurine, dress it, speak to it with elaborate courtesy mixed with firm boundaries. Great Lamashtu, daughter of Anu, we honor your power. Here are offerings worthy of your status. Please accept them and depart to the mountains where you reign supreme. It's like negotiating with a toddler who's also an apex predator. Then came the symbolic expulsion. They'd place the figurine in a miniature boat, an actual crafted vessel, sometimes quite elaborate, load it with provisions, and send it down the river. The accompanying incantation basically said, "You're not banished, you're just going on a trip, a permanent trip, downstream, away from here, forever." The psychological sophistication is remarkable. Don't anger the demon by rejecting her. Instead, convince her she's choosing to leave, that somewhere else is better, that she's not being defeated but redirected. You're standing beside that ancient mother now, watching the tiny boat drift away in the current, carrying its clay passenger into the dark. Her baby's fever broke this morning. The physician says the crisis has passed, and she'll never know if it was the medicine, the herbal tinctures, the cooling compresses, the careful nursing, or the ceremony, the prayers, the boat disappearing around the river bend. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the medicine treated the body while the ritual treated the soul, and both were necessary. Maybe fighting demons and fighting disease were never separate battles. Maybe they still aren't. You're standing at a crossroads of time, watching something impossible. A demon evolving, shape-shifting through millennia like a virus learning new hosts. Lamashtu didn't die when Babylon fell. She didn't fade when the cuneiform tablets stopped being carved. She just learned new languages, adopted new names, and kept doing what she'd always done, haunting the space between cradle and grave, between hope and grief, between the child you have and the child you're terrified of losing. First, she migrated north and west. Jewish communities during the Babylonian exile encountered her, absorbed her, transformed her. She became Lilith, Adam's first wife in some traditions, a night demon who strangles infants in others. The details shift, but the core remains. A female entity who targets children and pregnant women, who comes in darkness, who can be warded off with amulets and prayers and names written on doorposts. The methodology transferred wholesale. Medieval Jewish communities hung protective charms above cribs that look almost identical to Mesopotamian Lamashtu amulets from 3,000 years earlier. Same demon, new branding. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Aramaic incantation bowls, dating from roughly 400 to 700 CE, contain hundreds of references to Lilith using nearly identical protective formulas and imagery as earlier Lamashtu texts. These bowls were buried under house foundations specifically to protect children and mothers, proof that the same demon-warding technology persisted for over 2,000 years across multiple cultures and languages. That's longer than Christianity has existed, longer than most cities have stood. The fear was that durable. Then she jumped to Greece and Rome. The Greeks had Lamia, a child-eating female monster. The Romans had Strix, night demons that drained infants. Medieval Europe developed an entire ecosystem of similar entities. Changelings left in place of stolen babies, hags that caused sleep paralysis and stillbirth, night visitors that induced fever and wasting sickness. The names changed, but the narrative DNA remained pure Lamashtu. Female, nocturnal, targeting the vulnerable, susceptible to specific countermeasures involving iron, salt, prayers, and protective symbols. Historians still argue whether this represents cultural diffusion, the same demon genuinely migrating through trade routes and population movements, or parallel evolution, different cultures independently creating similar entities to explain the same universal trauma of child mortality. Maybe both. Maybe Lamashtu was so perfectly designed as a conceptual entity, so precisely calibrated to embody parental fear, that she became inevitable. Any culture that buried children needed something like her. And here's where it gets really interesting. She never stopped evolving. Victorian England had decline and consumption theories that blamed mysterious wasting diseases on environmental miasmas that sound remarkably like demonic visitation, invisible forces entering homes, targeting children, leaving specific symptom patterns. The language shifted from supernatural to pseudoscientific, but the underlying structure remained. Something from outside invades your safe space and attacks your child in ways medicine can't quite explain or prevent. Your quirky tidbit: in 19th century rural Germany, some communities still practiced a modified version of the boat ceremony. When a child died, they'd create a tiny wooden box containing a doll, small offerings, and a note requesting the night visitor to leave with the deceased child and not return for the living siblings. They'd float these boxes in rivers during new moons. Folklorists documented dozens of these practices, some continuing into the early 1900s. Lamashtu's boat was still sailing 4,000 years later, now carrying Victorian grief downstream. Modern horror cinema rediscovered her repeatedly. Every movie about demonic entities targeting children, every story about mothers making desperate bargains to protect their babies, every narrative about something coming through the window in the night. That's Lamashtu wearing a new mask. Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, Hereditary, The Babadook. They're all variations on her original theme. Even when filmmakers don't know her name, they're channeling her archetype because she represents something fundamentally human and fundamentally terrifying. The absolute vulnerability of new life and the inadequacy of love alone to protect it. And maybe that's why she persisted when countless other demons faded into obscurity. War gods became obsolete when we stopped believing in divine combat. Fertility goddesses lost relevance when we understood reproduction. Agricultural demons disappeared with scientific farming. But Lamashtu? Her domain never became obsolete. Children still get sick. Mothers still wake at 3 a.m. listening for breathing. Fever still spikes without clear cause. SIDS still happens. Miscarriages still occur. Childhood cancer still exists. The medical terminology changed, but the terror didn't. You're back in the present now, scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m. because you heard a noise from the baby monitor. You check the app, everything's fine. The infant's sleeping peacefully. Room temperature optimal. Oxygen levels normal. But you get up anyway. You walk down the hall anyway. You stand in the doorway watching that tiny chest rise and fall, counting breaths. And for just a moment, you understand every parent who ever carved an amulet, whispered a prayer, or launched a boat into darkness. Because Lamashtu's real genius wasn't her mythology, it was her psychology. She didn't represent some abstract cosmic evil. She represented the specific, visceral terror of being responsible for something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. She was the personification of every worst-case scenario playing in parental minds during sleepless nights. She was anxiety given form, paranoia made manifest, helplessness transformed into an enemy you could at least name and face. And naming matters. Remember that scribe 4,000 years ago, hands shaking as he carved her name into clay? He wasn't empowering the demon. He was empowering himself. Because nameless dread is paralyzing. But a named threat can be studied, understood, prepared for, defended against. The first demon name was the first act of taking back control from chaos. She's still out there, in a sense. Not literally, probably not literally. Though at 3 a.m. your rational mind gets fuzzy on this point. But she's there in every parent's midnight fears, every anxiety spike when the baby's too quiet, every irrational certainty that something's wrong despite all evidence to the contrary. She's the voice that says, check one more time, and what if, and you should worry more. Maybe that's immortality for a demon. Not physical persistence, but psychological permanence. Lamashtu doesn't need believers anymore. She just needs parents. And as long as humans create new life, they're terrified of losing. As long as love makes us vulnerable to grief. As long as we lie awake listening to baby monitors in the dark, she'll be there. The first demon ever named. Still unnamed in so many ways. Still hunting in the dark. Still teaching us that sometimes the oldest stories are old because they're true. Not in fact, but in feeling. Not in history, but in the parts of human experience that never change, no matter how many millennia pass. You check the monitor one more time before trying to sleep. Everything's fine. Probably. You're standing in a bronze smith's workshop in ancient Babylon, around 800 BCE, and the air tastes like metal and fear. The craftsman is working on something that makes your modern sensibilities deeply uncomfortable. An amulet head so grotesque, so deliberately nightmarish, that you instinctively want to look away. But you can't. Because this isn't art meant to disturb. It's art meant to protect. And the face staring back at you from that bronze is Pazuzu, king of the wind demons, and he's about to become your new roommate. Let's get the physical description out of the way, because it matters. Pazuzu has a dog's face. Not a cute dog. Think feral street dog with too many teeth. Bulging eyes that never blink. A scaly body covered in what looks like reptilian armor. 4 wings sprouting from his back. Talons instead of feet. A scorpion's tail curling upward. And, this is the part that really sells it, a serpent-headed penis. Because apparently ancient Mesopotamian demon designers believed in commitment to a theme. He's what happens when you let a nightmare design its own business card. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of Pazuzu amulet heads across Mesopotamia, making him one of the most mass-produced protective objects in the ancient world. These weren't rare occult items for the wealthy. They were everywhere, in every social class, hung above doorways, windows, and especially cradles. More Pazuzu amulets survive today than almost any other Mesopotamian artifact category. That's not coincidence. That's testimony to how badly people needed him. But here's the twist that makes your brain hurt. Pazuzu isn't a good guy. He's explicitly, textually, canonically evil. He's the demon of the southwestern wind, the hot desert blast that brings famine, locusts, drought, and disease. His wind scorches crops, dries up wells, and carries plague. In the Mesopotamian supernatural hierarchy, he's basically a natural disaster with personality. His own mythology describes him as malevolent, destructive, and dangerous. The texts are very clear on this point. So why are you hanging his face above your baby's crib? Because Mesopotamia understood something we've mostly forgotten. Sometimes you don't need a hero. Sometimes you need something scarier than the thing trying to hurt you. Pazuzu's protection wasn't about his goodness. It was about his badness being strategically useful. Think of it like hiring the neighborhood's toughest gang to guard your house. You're not confused about what they are. You're just betting they're territorial. The inscriptions on Pazuzu amulets are wonderfully blunt about this arrangement. They typically read some variation of, "I am Pazuzu, son of Hanbi, king of the evil wind demons. I oppose the wind from the mountains." That's it. No claims of benevolence or righteousness. Just a business transaction. I'm terrible, yes, but I'm your terrible, and I have beef with other demons that want to mess with you. Historians still argue whether Pazuzu's protective role represents a genuine theological position, like he actually wanted to help humans, or whether it was purely transactional, demons having their own territorial disputes that humans could exploit. The texts don't clarify his motivations. He doesn't explain why he opposes Lamashtu and other child-threatening entities. He just does, and ancient Mesopotamians were pragmatic enough not to question useful providence. Your quirky tidbit: some Pazuzu amulets include tiny inscribed instructions on their backs, essentially user manuals for demon management. They specify which direction to face the amulet, usually outward toward the street. What time of day to install it? Sunset, naturally. And even what prayers to recite during installation. One particularly detailed example includes a warning that the amulet must see the approach to work properly, suggesting they believed Pazuzu needed line of sight to intercept threats. It's like ancient security camera placement theory, except your camera is a demon's head. The workshop you're standing in produces these by the dozen. There's a whole assembly line: wax modeling, clay molds, bronze casting, cooling, finishing. The craftsmen treat it like any other manufacturing job, which it essentially is. Demon face production, supernatural home security installation. The ancient equivalent of ADT systems, except instead of calling the police, your alarm summons a wind demon who scares off intruders through sheer aggressive ugliness. And it worked. At least it worked psychologically, which might be the only kind of working that matters. Parents who hung Pazuzu amulets slept better. They felt agency, control, preparedness. When their children survived infancy, and remember, that was maybe a 60-40 proposition at best, they credited Pazuzu. When tragedy struck anyway, they could tell themselves they'd done everything possible, that they'd hired the best protection available, that sometimes even demons lose fights. You're watching a mother receive her commissioned amulet now. She can barely afford it. She's traded 3 months of woven goods for this single bronze head. But she clutches it like it's worth more than gold, because to her it is. Her first child died last year. Fever, then stillness, then grief that has no bottom. She's pregnant again, and she's not going to take chances this time. She's bringing in the big guns. The biggest, ugliest, most terrifying gun available. She hangs Pazuzu above her doorway, and his bulging eyes stare out into the Babylonian night, watching for threats. His dog face snarls at the darkness. His wings spread in eternal warning, and somewhere out there, other demons see that face and think, not worth it. That house is claimed. That family has protection. Better find easier prey. Because that's the genius of Pazuzu. He's not fighting evil with good. He's fighting evil with evil that's been weaponized, channeled, aimed. He's the proof that ancient Mesopotamia understood moral complexity in ways modern fantasy often doesn't. Sometimes the scariest monster makes the best guard dog. Sometimes you survive not by being pure, but by being smart about which demons you make deals with. The craftsman hands you an amulet fresh from the mold, still warm. Pazuzu's eyes seem to follow you. His snarl looks almost like a smile, and you understand viscerally what those ancient families understood. Protection doesn't always come in gentle forms. Sometimes it comes with wings and scales and teeth. And you hang it above your door and whisper thank you to something that would terrify you under any other circumstances. Welcome to Mesopotamian home security. Sleep tight. Pazuzu's watching. You're holding 2 amulets now, 1 in each hand, and you need to understand the relationship between them to grasp the full genius or madness of what ancient Mesopotamians were attempting. Left hand, Lamashtu, the child devourer, lion-headed nightmare riding her donkey through darkness. Right hand, Pazuzu, the wind demon, dog-faced and wings spread. And these two? They hate each other with a fury that transcends divine hierarchy, cosmic order, and apparently common sense. The texts never fully explain why. That's the maddening part. You get hints, fragments, implications. Some tablets suggest they were rivals before Lamashtu got kicked out of heaven. Others hint at territorial disputes. Lamashtu claims the domestic sphere. Pazuzu rules the wilderness winds. And where those domains overlap becomes a supernatural battlefield with your home as the contested territory. A few obscure references suggest something more personal, maybe even romantic, gone catastrophically wrong, though scholars treat those interpretations cautiously because ancient Sumerian relationship drama is hard to verify. What matters is this: they cannot stand each other's presence. Where Pazuzu appears, Lamashtu retreats. It's not about power levels. Some texts suggest Lamashtu is actually stronger in direct confrontation. It's about mutual, absolute, irrational hatred, the kind of beef that makes both parties willing to abandon everything else just to spite the other. And ancient Mesopotamian parents looked at this demon feud and thought, we can work with this. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Combination amulets depicting both Pazuzu and Lamashtu exist, with Pazuzu typically shown driving Lamashtu away or standing guard while she's bound. These dual demon plaques were expensive, premium protection, the ancient equivalent of a comprehensive security package. Some examples show Lamashtu in her boat being sent downriver, while Pazuzu watches from above, ensuring she actually leaves. It's supernatural restraining order enforcement, bronze cast, and blessed. The logic was brutally simple. You can't destroy Lamashtu. She's too powerful, too ancient, too fundamental to the cosmic order. You can't negotiate with her. Remember those elaborate ceremonies? They worked sometimes, but she always came back eventually, prowling other cradles, seeking other children. But you can keep her away by maintaining something she finds even more intolerable than missing out on a victim: being near Pazuzu. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to keep raccoons out of your garbage. You can't eliminate all raccoons. You can't reason with raccoons. But if you know raccoons hate coyotes, and you can somehow convince a coyote to hang around your property, well, now you've got a raccoon solution. Sure, you also have a coyote, which brings its own problems, but priorities. And at least coyotes don't eat babies. Usually. The metaphor breaks down a bit, but you get the idea. The inscriptions on dual amulets are fascinatingly specific about this arrangement. One particularly well-preserved example from Nineveh reads roughly, Pazuzu stands guard at this threshold. Lamashtu, who sees him, will not approach. The wind that kills crops protects the child. The daughter of Anu flees before the son of Hanbi. It's acknowledging both demons' destructive nature while creating a hierarchy of acceptable threats. Yes, Pazuzu might bring famine, but he won't touch your infant. That's Lamashtu's specialty, and she's banned from the premises. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine theological belief or sophisticated psychological coping mechanism. Did Mesopotamians literally believe Pazuzu's presence repelled Lamashtu? Or was the amulet primarily about giving terrified parents a sense of control and agency? The texts treat it as literal. Priests prescribed specific Pazuzu amulet types based on Lamashtu attack severity, like dosing medication. But the psychological benefit was undeniable regardless. You've done something. You've taken action. You've recruited an ally, even if that ally is himself terrifying. Your quirky tidbit. Some households took the protection system to elaborate extremes, creating what archaeologists call demon ecology management. They'd hang multiple Pazuzu heads at different entry points, door, windows, even chimney holes, creating overlapping fields of protection. A few wealthy estates have been excavated showing Pazuzu amulets at every corner, plus additional ones buried under foundations, creating a three-dimensional protective grid. One particularly paranoid, or perhaps experienced family in Ur apparently employed 17 separate Pazuzu installations around a single nursery. That's not protection anymore. That's fortification. That's demon-proofing your house like you're expecting siege warfare. And maybe they were. Because here's the thing about Lamashtu. She was patient. She was persistent. She had eternity. If she couldn't get through the front door today, she'd try the window tomorrow. Next week, she'd test the back entrance. She'd probe for weaknesses, wait for lapses, exploit any moment when the protection failed, or the amulet fell, or someone forgot to refresh the incantations. So you needed protection that was equally tireless. Pazuzu never slept. He was wind, constant and eternal. He never got distracted, never took breaks, never forgot why he was there. That bronze head above your door stared into darkness every single night, without rest, without boredom, without the human tendency to let your guard down when nothing bad has happened lately. He was the perfect security system because he wasn't human. He couldn't be exhausted, bribed, or reasoned with. You're watching a ritual installation now, a priest blessing a new Pazuzu amulet before it's mounted. The ceremony is surprisingly simple compared to the elaborate Lamashtu exorcisms. No multi-day productions, no expensive offerings, no theatrical boat sendings. Just a prayer acknowledging Pazuzu's power, a request for his territorial protection, and a promise to maintain the amulet. Keep it clean, keep it visible, keep it properly positioned. It's transactional, professional. You're not worshipping Pazuzu, you're employing him. The priest explains to the anxious father commissioning the work. Lamashtu knows this face. She remembers their hatred. Where he watches, she will not come. Not because she cannot, but because she will not endure his presence. Your child sleeps under his guard now. The king of evil wines has accepted your threshold as his territory. And the father nods, understanding the bargain he's made. He's invited something dangerous into his home, yes. But it's a known danger, a predictable danger, a danger with clear boundaries and expectations. Better than random chaos, better than helpless waiting. Better than waking every night wondering if tonight's the night something comes through the window. Remember that mother from earlier who bought the amulet with 3 months of woven goods. Her baby survives, grows into a healthy toddler. She credits Pazuzu, makes offerings of thanks at his amulet. Small things, grain or beer or honey. She tells neighbors about her demon guard. They commission their own. Pazuzu's protection spreads through the city like a particularly aggressive marketing campaign, except the product is possibly not losing your child to supernatural forces. And the system works, not because demons are real, maybe, but because belief in the system is real, and that belief carries power. The power to sleep, the power to hope, the power to feel like you've done something, anything, to shift the odds in your favor when mortality rates are catastrophic and medicine is limited, and sometimes all you can do is hang a monster's face above your door and pray it scares away worse monsters. That's the bargain. That's always been the bargain. You're sitting in a movie theater in 1973 watching The Exorcist, and something's bothering you. Not the pea soup or the head spinning or Linda Blair's genuinely unsettling performance. Those are working exactly as intended. No, it's the demon's name. Pazuzu. The entity possessing Reagan, the ultimate evil, the thing that requires maximum faith and 2 priests and arguably divine intervention to defeat, is named Pazuzu. And if you'd been a Mesopotamian parent 3,000 years ago, you would have run out of that theater screaming, not in horror, but in confusion. Because William Peter Blatty just made the guard dog into the burglar. Here's what happened. Blatty was researching ancient demons for his novel, looking for something authentically old and terrifying. He found Pazuzu in archaeological records, saw that grotesque face, read descriptions of him as king of evil wind demons, and thought, perfect, ancient, established, genuinely attested. He either didn't know or chose to ignore that Pazuzu's entire mythological function was protection. Or maybe he understood something deeper, that the line between protector and threat is thinner than we like to admit, especially when the protector is himself a monster. The irony is delicious. The Exorcist became one of the most successful horror films ever made, spawned a franchise, defined demonic possession in popular culture for generations. And it did all this while featuring a demon whose original job description was literally prevents the exact scenario this movie depicts. Imagine a horror movie about a psycho killer where the killer is actually a very confused neighborhood watch captain. That's approximately the mythological inversion Blatty accomplished. Here's your mainstream historical fact. When The Exorcist was released, several museums and archaeological institutions reported increased public interest in Mesopotamian artifacts, specifically Pazuzu amulets. The British Museum's Assyrian collection saw a notable uptick in visitors asking to see the demon from the movie. Some scholars were horrified. Others saw it as an opportunity for public education. A few pointed out the profound misunderstanding at work, but mostly people just wanted to see the scary demon head. Marketing accomplished, I guess, even if the marketing was 3,000 years delayed and completely backward. But here's where it gets interesting from a mythological continuity perspective. Maybe Blatty accidentally captured something true about Pazuzu, something the ancient texts hint at, but never fully explore. Because protecting your home by threatening worse evil is itself a kind of possession, isn't it? You're inviting something inhuman across your threshold. You're allowing it access, authority, presence. You're saying, come in, stay, watch over us, and you're trusting, hoping, praying that it stays on your side, that it remembers the bargain, that it doesn't decide one night that your family looks pretty appetizing after all. The ancient texts never explore what happens if Pazuzu gets bored or angry or hungry or forgetful about whose side he's on. They present him as reliably hostile to Lamashtu, and therefore reliably protective of humans. But that's correlation, not causation. What if his hatred of Lamashtu is seasonal? What if it depends on his mood? What if there are circumstances where the enemy of my enemy equation stops working? The Mesopotamians hung his face everywhere, and apparently just hoped these questions never needed answers. Historians still argue whether the absence of Pazuzu turned on us stories in the archaeological record means it never happened, or whether those stories simply weren't carved into permanent media because they didn't fit the protective narrative people needed to believe. Maybe a few families had bad experiences, maybe some amulets failed, maybe occasionally the guard dog bit. We don't know, because the texts that survive are mostly the ones that reinforced successful protection, the ones that got copied and preserved and passed down. So in a weird way, The Exorcist explores the shadow possibility that Mesopotamian mythology politely declined to examine. What if you invite the demon in and it doesn't leave? What if your protector becomes your possessor? What if the thing you brought across the threshold to guard against external threats becomes the internal threat? Blatty's Pazuzu is the dark mirror of the ancient bargain. What happens when it goes wrong, when the monster you're using as a tool remembers it's a monster? Your quirky tidbit. After The Exorcist's release, a few fringe occultist groups actually started using Pazuzu in invocation rituals, not as protector, but as exactly what the movie portrayed. Some grimoires from the 1970s and 80s include Pazuzu in lists of demons to summon for various purposes, citing his biblical authority. Except, of course, Pazuzu isn't biblical. He's Mesopotamian, predates the Bible by over 1,000 years, and his entire traditional function was opposite to these new uses. It's like if someone watched Jaws and decided sharks were great for herding sheep. Cultural telephone game gone completely sideways. Modern horror has continued the confused tradition. Video games, novels, TV shows, they keep using Pazuzu as a villain, almost never as a protector. His grotesque appearance and demon classification override his actual mythology. The visual does the work. You see that dog face with those wings and that scorpion tail, and your brain says threat, not guard. Which maybe proves something about human psychology. We trust beauty and fear ugliness, even when the ugly thing is explicitly there to help us. But walk into certain museum collections today, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and you'll find him. Rows of bronze Pazuzu heads, some still showing traces of the leather cords that hung them above ancient doorways. They're usually displayed near Lamashtu plaques, the eternal enemies frozen in their eternal standoff. The museum placards explain the protection function, the historical context, the cultural significance. And occasionally, you'll see parents visiting with young children, reading those placards, and something will cross their faces. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Because whether you believe in demons or not, the psychology behind Pazuzu's bargain is eternal. We still make deals with frightening things to protect what we love. We still invite controlled dangers into our lives to ward off uncontrolled ones. We still calculate risk hierarchies. This threat is acceptable because it prevents that worse threat. We vaccinate our children, introduce controlled pathogens to prevent worse diseases. We install alarm systems that watch our homes with electronic eyes. We teach our kids to fear strangers but trust designated scary things. Police with guns, doctors with needles, teachers with authority. The mechanisms have changed, but the equation hasn't. Measured fear prevents chaotic fear. Known monsters guard against unknown ones. You're standing in your own home now, at 3 a.m., and maybe you've got a baby monitor on the nightstand, or security cameras synced to your phone, or motion sensor lights outside, or some other technological guardian watching the dark. And for just a moment, you understand those ancient families who hung Pazuzu's face above their doors. Not because you believe in demons, probably not anyway, but because you understand the need for something, anything, standing between the ones you love and everything out there that could harm them. Pazuzu never needed to be real. He just needed to be there, staring into the night, eternal and tireless and terrifying enough that maybe, just maybe, worse things would think twice before approaching. He was hope cast in bronze. He was fear weaponized into protection. He was the friend you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley, but you're really glad he's on your side. And whether Hollywood got him backward or accidentally revealed his shadow truth, whether he was protector or possessor or somehow both, he served his purpose for 3,000 years and counting. That's not bad for a demon who supposedly brings famine and locusts. That's not bad for a monster we chose to trust. The amulet heads in those museum cases still have their bulging eyes, their snarling faces, their spreading wings. They're not threatening the visitors. They're just watching. Still on duty after all these millennia, still fulfilling the bargain, still standing guard over nothing and everything. You're standing on the walls of Uruk, circa 2700 BCE, and the city sprawls below you like a testament to human ambition and divine arrogance. The walls themselves, these massive fortifications you're leaning against, stretch for 9 kilometers, built by the king whose story you're about to witness. Gilgamesh. 2/3 god, 1/3 mortal, and 100% convinced that the rules applying to normal humans don't apply to him. Spoiler alert, he's about to learn otherwise, and it's going to break him in ways that empire building and monster slaying never could. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known work of literature, predating Homer by over 1,500 years. The earliest fragments date to around 2100 BCE, though the story itself references a historical king who likely ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE. That means people were telling this story, copying it, preserving it, for longer than Christianity has existed. Something about Gilgamesh's journey resonated so deeply that civilization after civilization kept his tablets, translated his adventures, and carved his grief into their own languages. But right now, Gilgamesh isn't grieving. He's insufferable. A tyrant, actually, if we're being honest. The opening tablets describe him claiming first-night rights with every bride, exhausting the young men with constant warfare and building projects, and generally behaving like someone who's never been told no, because, well, who's going to tell a demigod king no? The people of Uruk pray to the gods for relief, not for his death. You don't ask the gods to kill someone who's mostly God himself. That's just asking for trouble. But for something, anything, to humble him. The gods, in their infinite wisdom and questionable judgment, create Enkidu, not to defeat Gilgamesh, but to befriend him. This is some next-level divine psychology. Your problem isn't that you're too powerful, it's that you're lonely. So here's a companion who's your equal. Enkidu is raised by gazelles, lives naked in the wilderness, drinks from streams with the animals, and has never seen a city or tasted bread or worn clothing. He's basically the Platonic ideal of wild man, except the gods made him as strong as Gilgamesh, as fast, as fierce. A perfect match. And here's your quirky tidbit. The tablets describe Enkidu's civilization through an encounter with a temple prostitute named Shamhat, who seduces him for 7 days and 7 nights until the animals no longer recognize him as one of their own. After this, she teaches him to eat bread, drink beer, and wear clothes, in that order. Ancient Mesopotamia had very specific ideas about what constitutes becoming human, and apparently it's carbs, alcohol, and pants, in that exact sequence. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, they fight. Of course they fight. You don't introduce 2 alpha males without expecting a WWE-style throwdown. They wrestle through the streets, shaking buildings, terrifying citizens, and generally proving that toxic masculinity has ancient roots. But something happens during the fight. Mutual recognition, respect, understanding. When they finally stop, exhausted and laughing, they embrace as brothers. Gilgamesh has found his equal, and Enkidu has found his purpose. What follows is the stuff of legend, literally since it became legend. They go on adventures. They kill Humbaba, the demon guardian of the cedar forest, because apparently trophy hunting divine monsters is what passes for male bonding in ancient Mesopotamia. They reject the goddess Ishtar's romantic advances, which, pro tip, is never a good idea. So she sends the bull of heaven to destroy them, and they kill that too. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are unstoppable, invincible, the ultimate power couple, and they know it. Historians still argue whether their relationship was romantic, platonic, or something the ancient world didn't have clean categories for. The tablets describe their love as profound, transformative, soul-deep. Gilgamesh's mother adopts Enkidu as a second son. They sleep in the same tent, share dreams, finish each other's sentences. Whether that's brotherhood or something more, the grief that follows suggests it transcended whatever labels we might apply. Because here's the thing about being 2/3 God. You're still 1/3 mortal. And that mortal third, that's the part that dies. The gods decide Enkidu must pay for the bull of heaven's death. Not Gilgamesh. He's too divine, too protected, too important. Enkidu, the wild man who was created just to be Gilgamesh's companion, who found humanity through friendship, who learned to be civilized just in time to be civilized's greatest warrior. He gets the divine death sentence. It's arbitrary, unjust, and brutally unfair. Which is basically how mortality works. Enkidu falls ill. Not a warrior's death in battle, not a hero's end fighting monsters, just sickness, the slow collapse of the body, the indignity of wasting away in bed while the strongest man alive watches helplessly. For 12 days, Gilgamesh sits by his friend's side, watching him deteriorate, unable to do anything. Remember, this is a man who killed demons and divine bulls. But disease? Disease doesn't care about your divine parentage or your mighty thews or your impressive resume of monster slaying. Disease just takes. You're in that room now, watching Gilgamesh hold his friend's hand as Enkidu's breathing gets shallower. The king who never knew fear is discovering a new kind of terror, not of monsters or gods, but of absence, of loss, of the hole someone leaves when they stop being there. And Enkidu, in his final hours, has dreams, terrible dreams, visions of what comes next. He describes the underworld waiting for him, a house of dust where residents eat clay and drink mud, where they wear feathered garments like birds and sit in darkness forever. No sun, no joy, no relief, just existence without living, consciousness without experience, being without being anything in particular. It's not hellfire or punishment. It's worse than that. It's nothing. It's the absence of everything that makes life worth having. Gilgamesh listens to these dreams and realizes something that shatters his entire worldview. This is also his fate. 2/3 God doesn't matter. One day, he too will be eating clay in the dark. All the walls he's built, all the monsters he's killed, all the glory he's accumulated, none of it grants immunity from the house of dust. Enkidu dies at dawn. The strongest man alive holds his friend's body and discovers that strength means nothing against this. And the real horror, the thing that will drive the entire rest of the epic, is just beginning to dawn on him. You're still in that room, but it's darker now, colder, and something has changed in the air between midnight and dawn. Gilgamesh hasn't left Enkidu's side for 7 days and 7 nights. Yes, the same symbolic duration as Enkidu's original transformation into humanity. Because ancient Mesopotamian poets understood poetic structure. He's refusing to allow the burial, refusing to accept what his eyes clearly show him, and the body is beginning to decay. A fly lands on Enkidu's nostril. That's the detail the tablets preserve. That one fly, the moment Gilgamesh finally admits his friend isn't sleeping, isn't resting, isn't coming back. But here's where the epic takes its turn into genuine horror. The kind that doesn't need monsters or battles. Because Enkidu isn't done teaching Gilgamesh lessons. The tablets describe what happens next with the kind of matter-of-fact terror that makes your skin crawl, precisely because it's presented as normal, expected, part of the natural order. Gilgamesh performs the funeral rites, lavish ones, statues of lapis lazuli, offerings of honey and butter, sacrifices of animals, everything wealth and power can provide. He tears his hair, rips his royal garments, wanders into the wilderness wearing animal skins like Enkidu did when they first met. He's trying to return to the beginning, to reset the story, to find some loophole in reality where his friend isn't gone. And in his grief madness, he does what any desperate person would do. He tries to contact the dead. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains one of the earliest recorded descriptions of necromancy, the practice of communicating with the dead, in world literature. Tablet 22, which scholars debate is a later addition, but we'll get to that, describes Gilgamesh petitioning the gods to allow Enkidu's ghost to rise from the underworld. The god Ea agrees, and Nergal, god of the underworld, opens a hole in the earth. What emerges isn't comforting. Enkidu's ghost rises like a wind, not solid, not corporeal, just a presence, a whisper, a memory with enough consciousness to speak, but not enough substance to touch. Gilgamesh tries to embrace him, and his arms close on air. He tries to hold him, and there's nothing there. Just cold emptiness where warmth used to be. It's every nightmare about losing someone made literal. They're there, but not there. Present, but absent. themselves but also fundamentally changed into something you can't reach. And then Enkidu speaks. Oh, how he speaks. "Do you want to know what I've seen?" the ghost asks. "Do you want to know the order of the underworld?" And Gilgamesh, who spent weeks denying death's reality, suddenly has to hear about it in excruciating detail from the one person he loves most, the one person whose testimony he cannot doubt or dismiss. Enkidu describes the underworld with the precision of someone who's been living there, if living is the right word. It's not fiery torment. It's not dramatic punishment. It's worse. It's bureaucratic. There are hierarchies in the house of dust. Those who had many sons sit in privileged positions. Those who died in battle receive special water. Those who were properly buried fare better than those left to rot. Those who died by fire, their ghosts have no rest at all. It's an entire civilization of the dead, organized by how you died and how you were mourned. And everyone there eats dust and wears feathers and exists in darkness forever. Your quirky tidbit: the tablets specify that ghosts of people who died by fire have no rest. They don't even get to sit in the dust house with the others. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that cremation was considered religiously problematic in ancient Mesopotamia, possibly because it destroyed the body too completely for proper afterlife transition. Others suggest it reflects actual fire death trauma observations, victims of house fires or battlefield burns dying in ways that seem to prevent peaceful death. Either way, ancient Mesopotamians apparently thought burning was the worst way to go, afterlife-wise. Good to know if you ever time travel. But here's the truly horrifying part: the detail that breaks Gilgamesh completely. Enkidu describes the ghost of someone who has no one to mourn them, no family to make offerings, no descendants to speak their name. That ghost, he says, eats garbage scraps from the gutter, exists alone, has nothing, and the implication hangs there like a sword. Even in death, you need the living. The dead depend on the living to remember them, feed them through ritual, speak their names. Death isn't an ending. It's a transformation into something that still needs care, attention, maintenance. Historians still argue whether Tablet 13 was originally part of the epic or a later addition from a different Enkidu story cycle. The tone shifts, the narrative structure breaks, and some scholars think it was tacked on centuries after the main epic was composed. But here's the thing: thematically, it's perfect. Whether it's original or added, it serves the story's deeper truth. Gilgamesh needed to hear from Enkidu one last time. He needed his friend to confirm the nightmare is real, that the house of dust is waiting, that two-thirds God or not, he's going there eventually. The ghost delivers one more piece of devastating information. My body that you loved to touch, my body that made your heart glad, now it's infested with vermin like an old garment. The physical reality of death, the decay, the transformation of the beloved body into something unrecognizable. Enkidu makes Gilgamesh face it all. No poetry, no euphemism, just the truth. Death is physical corruption, and consciousness survives into a place where that corruption doesn't matter because everything is already corrupt, already dust, already finished. And then, because apparently one trauma isn't enough, the ghost tells him about their friend Ur-Shanabi's fate, about others they knew who've died, creating this litany of "here's what happened to everyone" that drives home the universality. Everyone ends up there. Everyone. Warriors, kings, priests, slaves. The House of Dust doesn't discriminate. It just receives. You're watching Gilgamesh's face as he processes this. Remember, this is a man who thought his divine blood made him special, exempt, different, and his best friend's ghost is explaining, with devastating clarity, that different only matters in life. In death, everyone's the same. Everyone eats dust. Everyone sits in darkness. Everyone depends on the living to remember their names. The hole in the earth closes. Enkidu's ghost descends back into the darkness, and Gilgamesh is left standing there with knowledge he can't unknow, carrying information he desperately wishes he'd never sought. His friend confirmed the nightmare, made it real, made it inevitable. And that's when Gilgamesh makes his decision. If death is coming for him, he'll find a way to outrun it. If mortality is the rule, he'll find the exception. If everyone dies, he'll be the one person who doesn't. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the world, lives Utnapishtim, the one human who survived the Great Flood and was granted eternal life by the gods. If one person escaped death, Gilgamesh will find him and learn how. The quest for immortality begins not from arrogance now, but from absolute paralyzing terror. And honestly, that makes it so much worse. You're following Gilgamesh into the wilderness now, and he looks nothing like the proud king from the city walls. He's wearing animal skins, his hair is matted, his face is gaunt from weeks of wandering. He looks, ironically, exactly like Enkidu did when they first met, which is probably the point. He's trying to become what his friend was, to inhabit that wildness, maybe to find some magic in it that will change the story's ending. Spoiler, it won't work. But watching him try is what makes this a tragedy instead of just a sad story. The journey to find Utnapishtim takes him to the literal edge of the world. He crosses mountains guarded by scorpion people, because of course the path to immortality is guarded by nightmare creatures. He travels through 12 leagues of darkness, a tunnel where no light penetrates, guided only by touch and desperation. He emerges in a garden where trees bear jewels instead of fruit, where everything is beautiful and crystalline and fundamentally wrong because nothing that's alive grows gems. It's a dead garden, an immortal garden, a place where nothing changes because nothing lives. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Gilgamesh flood story predates and likely influenced the biblical Noah narrative. Utnapishtim's tale of building a boat, saving animals, surviving divine-sent destruction, and receiving a covenant afterward contains too many specific parallels to be coincidence. When archaeologists first translated these tablets in the 1870s, it caused theological controversy. The Bible's flood story wasn't original or unique, but part of a much older Mesopotamian tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh was teaching people about survivors and immortality when the Hebrew Bible was still centuries from being written. Gilgamesh finally finds Utnapishtim living on a distant shore, and here's where the story gets really cruel. Because Utnapishtim isn't impressive. He's just a guy. Old, weathered, kind of annoying actually. He tells his flood story like your grandfather telling you about his commute in the snow. Back in my day, the gods decided to destroy all humanity, so I built a boat. He makes immortality sound boring, tedious, like a retirement that never ends. And when Gilgamesh begs for the secret, asks how he can achieve the same gift, Utnapishtim's answer is devastating. You can't. The gods assembled in council to grant me eternal life as reward for surviving their genocide. They're not assembling councils for you, Gilgamesh. That was a one-time deal, and you weren't invited. But Utnapishtim takes pity. He offers Gilgamesh a test. If you want to escape death, first escape sleep. Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Because sleep, he explains, is death's brother, the little rehearsal we do every night for the big performance. If Gilgamesh can't even defeat sleep, how's he going to defeat death? Your quirky tidbit. The tablets specify that Utnapishtim's wife bakes a loaf of bread each day and places it beside the sleeping Gilgamesh to mark the passage of time. 1 loaf for each day he fails the test. When Gilgamesh finally wakes, convinced he only dozed for a moment, Utnapishtim points to the 7 loaves in various stages of decay. The first is rock-hard and moldy, the last fresh from the oven. It's a beautifully cruel visual proof. Time passed while you slept, hero. You're not immune to unconsciousness, therefore not immune to death. The bread knows what you refuse to admit. Gilgamesh fails immediately. He falls asleep as soon as he sits down, exhausted from his journey, from his grief, from fighting reality for so long. When he wakes and sees the 7 loaves, he understands. He's not special. His divine blood doesn't grant exemption. Enkidu was right. The house of dust is waiting, and there's no clever bypass, no heroic solution, no way to fight this enemy. Historians still argue whether the epic's ending represents acceptance or resignation. Because here's what happens next. Utnapishtim's wife, moved by Gilgamesh's obvious grief, tells her husband to send him home with something. So Utnapishtim reveals one final secret. At the bottom of the primordial ocean grows a plant that restores youth. Not immortality, but renewal, the ability to age backward, to return to vitality, to buy more time. Gilgamesh dives. He retrieves the plant. He names it, "The old man becomes young again," which is simultaneously very literal and extremely on the nose for ancient Mesopotamian naming conventions. And he starts the long journey home to Uruk, planning to share this plant with his people, to let them taste renewed youth, maybe to use it himself when age finally comes for him. He stops at an oasis to bathe, and while he's in the water, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the pool, and eats it. Immediately, the snake sheds its skin, renewed, reborn, young again, and it slithers away, leaving Gilgamesh sitting naked in the water, holding nothing, having lost even the consolation prize. This is the moment that breaks you if the rest somehow hasn't. He came so close. He actually found something, not immortality, but at least hope, at least possibility. And it's taken by a snake. Random, meaningless, the universe's cruel joke. The tablets describe Gilgamesh weeping, not the wild grief when Enkidu died, but something quieter, deeper, the crying of someone who's finally, completely out of options. He returns to Uruk empty-handed. And here's where the epic makes its final, brilliant move. The closing tablets have Gilgamesh showing a companion. Some versions say Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman who helped him. The walls of Uruk. The same walls we started on. "Look," he says, Look at these walls I built. Look at the foundation, the brickwork, the gates. Examine them. No one has ever built walls like these. No one who comes after me will build their equal. It's not immortality. It's legacy. The thing you build, create, leave behind. That's what survives. Not your body, not your consciousness, but your work, your impact, the difference you made while you had time. The walls will stand long after Gilgamesh becomes dust. His name will be remembered in stories, and oh, how it was, for 4,000 years and counting. That's the only victory available against mortality, to make something that outlasts your flesh. You're standing on those walls again now, full circle, and they're ruins. Because even walls fall eventually, even legacies erode, even the oldest stories get fragmented and lost and found and translated. The original Gilgamesh, the historical king, probably did build impressive walls. He probably was a tyrant. He probably had a friend. But did he quest for immortality? Did he meet Utnapishtim? Did a snake really steal his last hope? It doesn't matter. The story's truth isn't historical. It's emotional. Every human who's ever loved someone and lost them understands Gilgamesh's grief. Every person who's faced their own mortality recognizes his desperation. Every time we try to make something that will outlast us, art, children, buildings, stories, we're doing what Gilgamesh did. We're building walls against the dark, knowing they'll eventually fall, building them anyway, because what else can we do? The Epic of Gilgamesh teaches one lesson with 4,000 years of authority. Everyone dies, even heroes, even kings, even the ones who are 2/3 divine. The house of dust is waiting. But between now and then, you can love someone so deeply their loss shatters you. You can build something worth remembering. You can leave walls standing, stories told, impacts made. That's not immortality, but it's what we get. And the oldest story humanity ever wrote is telling you, across millennia in languages long dead, that it's enough. It has to be enough. Because even for Gilgamesh, mighty king of Uruk, 2/3 god and slayer of monsters, it was all he got in the end. The sun rises over the ruins. The walls still stand, partly. The story survives in fragments, reconstructed from tablets scattered across museums worldwide. And somewhere in there, Gilgamesh finally learned what even kings must fear. Not death itself, but dying without having lived in ways that matter. Loved in ways that transform, built in ways that endure. The house of dust can wait. Tonight, you're still here, still breathing, still capable of building something worth remembering. Make it count. You're standing in the temple district of around 2300 BCE, and the moon is doing something strange tonight. It's full, luminous, casting shadows sharp enough to cut. And you're watching a young woman walk toward the temple of Nana, the moon god. She's wearing the elaborate headdress of a high priestess, wool wound with gold thread, lapis lazuli beads catching moonlight like captured stars. Her name is Enheduanna, and she's about to become the most powerful woman in the Akkadian Empire. Also, incidentally, the first author in human history whose name we actually know. Let that sink in for a moment. Before Homer, before any biblical scribe, before every anonymous poet and storyteller whose works survived without attribution, there's her. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the empire builder who conquered Sumeria and needed a way to hold it together. And his solution? Make his daughter the high priestess of Ur's most important temple. Give her religious authority that transcends political boundaries, and let her speak for the gods themselves. It's brilliant strategy wrapped in sacred ritual, and it's about to change how humanity thinks about divine communication. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Enheduanna is the first author in recorded history whose name, biography, and works have survived. We have her hymns, her temple position, even a disc showing her image performing rituals. She wasn't just writing, she was signing her work, claiming authorship, asserting identity in ways that wouldn't become common for another 1,000 years. Before Enheduanna, literature was anonymous. After her, writers existed as people with names, histories, voices. But you need to understand what being high priestess actually meant, because it wasn't just ceremonial. She was en priestess. The term means something like lord or lady, carrying political weight. She managed temple estates, controlled significant wealth, directed rituals, and most importantly, spoke on behalf of Inanna, the goddess of love, war, sex, and divine fury. Inanna wasn't some gentle mother figure. She was volatile, powerful, dangerous, the goddess who descended to the underworld and returned, who destroyed cities when insulted, who demanded worship with threats and promises in equal measure. And Enheduanna was her voice. When the priestess spoke, it was the goddess speaking through her. When she wrote hymns, they weren't just poetry. They were divine will made text. She held authority that kings couldn't touch because kings were mortal administrators, but she spoke for eternity itself. At least that was the theory. The practice, as you're about to see, was significantly more complicated and considerably more dangerous. Your quirky tidbit. Enheduanna's title wasn't just High Priestess. She was specifically the en priestess of Nanna, but her writings focus almost entirely on Inanna, Nanna's daughter. Some scholars suggest this was strategic theology, linking the moon god of Ur with the more widely worshipped Inanna to create religious continuity across Sargon's empire. Others think Enheduanna had genuine devotional preference, that she felt closer to the goddess of complexity and contradiction than to the stable, predictable moon god. Either way, she essentially rewrote the divine hierarchy through poetry, making Inanna central to imperial religion while technically serving her father god. That's some sophisticated theological maneuvering. You're following her into the temple now, and the interior smells like incense, cedar and myrrh, mixed with dates and barley beer from offerings. The moonlight streams through high windows, illuminating her as she approaches the altar. She's not just performing ritual, she's composing while she prays. You can see her lips moving, testing phrases, finding rhythms. Because here's the thing about Enheduanna. She didn't just recite traditional hymns. She wrote new ones. She innovated. She created literary forms that didn't exist before her. Her most famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, is part prayer, part autobiography, part political manifesto, part theological argument. It's a genre she essentially invented, personal devotional literature where the author's voice, experience, and identity are inseparable from the religious content. She writes, "My lady, I will proclaim your greatness in all lands. I, Enheduanna, will praise your holy dwelling." She's right there in the text, claiming her role, her name, her act of creation. Historians still argue whether Enheduanna's appointment was purely political, Sargon using religion to consolidate power, or whether she had genuine religious authority and vocation that happened to serve political purposes. The answer is probably both. That uncomfortable space where sincere belief and strategic advantage overlap. She might have truly felt called by Inanna, while also understanding her role in maintaining her father's empire. Faith and politics weren't separate categories in ancient Mesopotamia. They were the same thing, approached from different angles. But here's what makes her genuinely remarkable beyond the historical firsts. Her writing is good. Not just good for being old or good considering the context. It's genuinely powerful poetry that works even in translation, even across 4,000 years. When she writes about feeling abandoned by her goddess, you feel it. When she describes divine fury, you flinch. When she celebrates Inanna's power, you understand why people worshiped this goddess for millennia. Queen of all the great powers, radiant light, righteous woman clothed in radiance. That's how she opens one hymn, and the Sumerian rhythm, even transliterated into English, has momentum, building through repetition and variation until the goddess feels present, imminent, dangerous. This isn't primitive verse. This is sophisticated literature using techniques that poets still employ today. You watch her finish the evening ritual and return to her chambers, rooms attached to the temple complex where she lives, works, studies, and writes. Clay tablets are scattered across tables, each one carefully inscribed in cuneiform, each one a conversation with the divine that will be copied, preserved, distributed across the empire. She's building something bigger than any wall her father ever constructed. She's building a unified religious culture through literature, making Inanna's worship central, tying disparate cities together through shared hymns and rituals. And it's working. For years, it works beautifully. The empire holds. The goddess is praised. Enheduanna's influence spreads. She's untouchable, protected by both divine authority and political power. Until suddenly, catastrophically, she isn't. You're still in those temple chambers, but everything has changed. The year is uncertain, sometime during Sargon's later reign or shortly after, and a man named Lugal-Ane has seized control of Ur. A rebel, a usurper, someone who sees Enheduanna not as a holy intermediary, but as a political threat, a symbol of the old regime that needs removing. And you're watching as temple guards, men who yesterday protected her, now stand aside while Lugal-Ane's soldiers enter the sacred precinct. They strip her of the priestess regalia. The elaborate headdress comes off first, those gold-wound threads and lapis beads that marked her divine office. Then the ceremonial robes. They don't harm her physically. Even rebels understand the danger of killing a priestess who speaks for the goddess of war. But they do something worse. They exile her. Remove her from the temple. Erase her authority by simple displacement, making her just a woman instead of a voice of the divine. Here's your mainstream historical fact. We know about Enheduanna's exile because she wrote about it. The exaltation of Inanna includes autobiographical sections describing her removal from the temple, her wandering, her desperate appeals to the goddess who seems to have abandoned her. It's the first recorded instance of an author writing about personal trauma, using literature as both processing mechanism and political weapon. She's not just recording history, she's shaping it, fighting back with the only tool she has left: words. The poem describes her situation with raw vulnerability that's startling to encounter in such ancient text. I, the brilliant high priestess of Nana, me he has driven out of the temple. Like a swallow he made me fly from the window. That image, the swallow forced from the window, captures both her displacement and her fragility, the violence of sudden powerlessness. One moment you're speaking for gods, the next you're a refugee, homeless, stripped of identity and purpose. But here's where Enheduanna becomes genuinely fascinating. She doesn't just lament. She weaponizes her grief. The exile poem is simultaneously a prayer to Inanna and a curse against Lugal-ane. She's calling down divine vengeance while establishing written record of his sacrilege. That man has altered everything, has turned the temple into a place of destruction. She's documenting his crimes for posterity, for the gods, for whatever audience might eventually restore her. Your quirky tidbit. Some tablets containing the exaltation of Inanna show signs of having been deliberately copied and distributed even during Enheduanna's exile, possibly by loyal scribes or temple functionaries who disagreed with Lugal-ane's coup. The poem functioned as both religious text and political resistance, circulating through channels the usurper couldn't fully control. It's the ancient equivalent of samizdat literature, underground resistance publishing. Enheduanna turned her exile into a distributed campaign, her suffering into propaganda, her prayers into political strategy. You're following her through the countryside now, watching her move from city to city, seeking shelter, searching for allies. She's lost everything except her literacy, her authority as Sargon's daughter, and her conviction that Inanna will eventually respond. And the poem tracks this journey, moving from despair through anger to eventual restoration of faith. It's a narrative arc, a story structure, showing that Enheduanna understood not just poetry, but dramatic progression. The middle section is the darkest. She accuses Inanna of abandoning her. I took my place in the sanctuary, but the day became hostile. The brilliant festival was turned to grief. There's genuine anger here, not just submission. She's challenging her goddess, demanding answers, refusing to accept suffering without explanation. This is revolutionary theology, the idea that you can argue with the divine, that faith includes questioning, that worship doesn't require passive acceptance. Historians still argue whether the exile was actual physical removal from the temple or metaphorical spiritual crisis expressed in exile imagery. Some scholars note that ancient Near Eastern literature used exile as a standard metaphor for divine abandonment. Others point to the specific political details, Lugal-ane's name, the mention of an temple desecration, as evidence of real events. Most likely, it's both. Real political coup described using literary conventions that gave it cosmic significance. But then comes the turn, the moment when Enheduanna's faith, or her political calculation, or both, reasserts itself. She renews her praise of Inanna, rebuilds her theological case for the goddess's supreme power, essentially argues her way back into divine favor through sheer persistence and literary brilliance. That you are lofty as the heavens, let this be known, that you are broad as the earth. Let this be known. She's not asking anymore. She's proclaiming, reclaiming her authority as speaker for the goddess by simply speaking, regardless of whether she has official permission. And somehow, miraculously or inevitably, depending on your interpretation, it works. The poem's ending describes her restoration. The First Lady of the Throne Room has accepted Enheduanna's song. Lugal-ane apparently falls, whether through military defeat, political maneuvering, or divine intervention, the texts don't clarify. Enheduanna returns to her temple. The proper order is restored. But something has fundamentally changed. She's written about doubt now, about abandonment, about the gap between divine promise and lived experience. She's created literature that acknowledges darkness while moving through it, that doesn't pretend faith is simple or constant. Future priestesses will read this text and know even the greatest servants of the goddess sometimes feel forsaken. Even the most faithful sometimes question. And that's part of the path, not a deviation from it. You're watching her re-enter the temple, older now, marked by what she's survived. They place the headdress back on her head, restore the robes, reinstate her authority. But she's different. She's seen what happens when divine protection fails, when political power shifts, when words are your only weapon. And she's learned that sometimes that's enough. Sometimes words survive when everything else collapses. She returns to her writing with renewed intensity. More hymns, more temple compositions, more literary innovations. But now there's an edge to them, a knowledge that authority is conditional, that power can vanish, that even speaking for gods doesn't guarantee safety. She writes like someone who knows her words might be all that survives her, so she makes them count, makes them powerful, makes them impossible to forget. And the tablets pile up, carefully inscribed, meticulously copied, distributed throughout the empire. Clay imprinted with wedge-shaped marks, each one carrying her voice forward into time, building something more durable than temples or empires, or even the goddess's favor. She's building immortality, one clay tablet at a time, writing her way into permanence through sheer refusal to be forgotten. You're standing in a museum now, in the present day, looking at a clay disc behind protective glass. It's called the Disc of Enheduanna, and it shows a woman in profile, priestess regalia, ritual pose, performing a libation before an altar. Behind her stand 3 attendants, and around the edge, in carefully carved cuneiform, runs her name, Enheduanna, the woman who spoke for the goddess, the woman whose voice refused to fade. This disc was created around 2300 BCE. You're looking at something older than the pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge's final form, older than the first Chinese dynasties. And it survived. Fire, flood, conquest, the collapse of entire civilizations, and this woman's face, this woman's name, persisted through all of it. That's not accident. That's testament to what she built with words. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Enheduanna's hymns were copied and recopied for over 500 years after her death, used as standard temple liturgy throughout Mesopotamia. Student scribes practiced their cuneiform by copying her verses. Her literary innovations, the personal devotional voice, the integration of autobiography and theology, became templates that influenced religious writing for millennia. You can trace direct lines from her work to biblical psalms, to later hymnic traditions, to the entire concept of personal relationship with the divine expressed through literature. But you need to understand the scale of what had to happen for her words to reach you. First, her original tablets had to be preserved, copied by scribes who considered her work worth transmitting. Then those copies had to survive the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the Ur-Thre dynasty, the Old Babylonian period. They had to be valued enough to keep copying even as spoken Sumerian died out, becoming a scholarly language like Latin, studied but no longer native to anyone. Then came the catastrophic burning of libraries when empires collapsed, fire that should have destroyed clay tablets, but instead baked them harder, accidentally preserving them. Then burial under centuries of sand and ruins. Then rediscovery by archaeologists in the 1800s and 1900s. Then the painstaking work of translation, of piecing together fragments, of reconstructing broken tablets from scattered pieces found in different sites years apart. Your quirky tidbit. One fragment of Enheduanna's Exaltation of Inanna was discovered being used as building material in a wall constructed 1,500 years after her death. Someone had repurposed an ancient tablet, not recognizing or caring about the text, and inadvertently preserved it by incorporating it into architecture. The tablet survived because it became structurally useful, its literary content irrelevant to its preservation. Sometimes immortality happens by accident, through misuse, through being valued for the wrong reasons. Historians still argue whether Enheduanna actually wrote her attributed works, or whether she represents a school of temple writers working under her name and authority. Some scholars point to stylistic variations, suggesting multiple authors. Others argue the variations reflect her writing across decades, natural evolution of voice and skill. The question might be unanswerable and might not matter. Whether she personally inscribed every tablet or directed a scriptorium, the voice is singular, the authority clear, the literary vision coherent. But here's what's undeniable. Her name survived. Not just her work, but her identity. She signed her hymns. She inserted herself into the texts. I, Enheduanna, appears repeatedly, claiming authorship, demanding recognition, insisting on personal presence in what should have been anonymous liturgy. That act, that assertion of self, changed literature forever. After her, authors mattered. Individual voices had value. Writing wasn't just recording tradition. It was creating something new that belonged to its creator. You're reading her words now, translated on the placard beside the disc. Queen of all the great powers, radiant light, righteous woman clothed in radiance, beloved of heaven and earth, Inanna, great in loveliness. The rhythm works even in English, even stripped of its original language's music. The devotion feels genuine across 4,300 years. She made the goddess present through language, and somehow that presence persists, captured in clay, transmitted through translations, still capable of evoking the divine Enheduanna served. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that her tablets survived, but that her voice survived. That reading her words, you hear her. A woman standing in moonlight, speaking for a goddess of contradictions, using poetry as prayer and politics and personal expression simultaneously. She understood something fundamental. Words are the only thing that outlast everything else. Empires fall, temples crumble, gods themselves fade when people stop speaking their names. But literature, properly crafted, carefully preserved, repeatedly copied, can survive anything. She died sometime in the late 2200s BCE, probably old, possibly restored to full authority, maybe confident her work would persist or maybe hoping desperately it would, uncertain like all writers whether anything survives the author's death. The tablets don't record her end. No dramatic finale, no final hymn, just the ordinary disappearance of a mortal woman who happened to be extraordinary. But her words kept speaking. Through the Babylonian period, scribes copied her hymns. Through the Assyrian Empire, students studied her literary techniques. When cuneiform finally died out, replaced by alphabetic writing, her tablets were buried but preserved, waiting in the sand for rediscovery. And when archaeologists finally unearthed them, cleaned them, translated them, suddenly Enheduanna was speaking again after 4,000 years of silence, still praising Inanna, still claiming her authorship, still insisting, "I was here, I wrote this, remember my name. The museum is closing now, lights dimming, and you take one last look at that disc. At her profile, forever frozen in ritual stance, forever performing her sacred duty. The Priestess of Uruk who spoke with gods when no one else dared, who wrote herself into immortality, who understood that the only way to defeat time is to create something worth preserving across centuries that haven't happened yet. And now, as the museum fades and you drift towards sleep, let yourself rest in the knowledge that Enheduanna discovered. Some things endure, some voices refuse silence. Somewhere in the world tonight, someone else is reading her words, hearing her voice across impossible distance, and she lives again in that moment of recognition. She's still speaking, still praising, still insisting on her name and her presence and her refusal to be forgotten. You've walked with a woman who touched moonlight and called it divine, who survived exile through poetry, who built monuments from clay and conviction, and as you close your eyes, you can almost hear her voice, that ancient cadence, those carefully chosen words still working their magic after all these centuries. My lady, I will proclaim your greatness, still proclaiming, still praising, still here, impossibly, wonderfully here. The clay tablets rest in climate-controlled museum storage. The cuneiform marks are permanent, baked by time and fire into something that outlasted bronze and stone. And somewhere in that preserved text lives a woman who refused to be anonymous, who claimed authorship when the concept barely existed, who spoke for gods and made sure everyone knew her name. Enheduanna, the first voice, still speaking, still heard, still teaching us that words, carefully chosen and courageously claimed, can survive anything, even 4,000 years of darkness. Rest now. Her words stand guard, her voice echoes forward, and in the morning, when you wake, you'll carry a piece of her story with you. The knowledge that what we create with care and claim with courage can outlast everything else. Even gods fade. But literature, literature endures. Sleep well, knowing you've met the first author, the priestess who spoke moonlight into permanence. Good night.